Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the second half of today's proceedings. Slight change to the plenary session. As you know, Jennifer Sims sadly cannot be with us today, so Greg Creverton is going to go solo, but afterwards we will have an impromptu panel consisting of myself, Bob de Graaf of the Netherlands Defence Academy at the University of Utrecht, and David Omand yet again, getting best value out of him. And the three of us will sort of say if anything comes to the top of our mind about Greg's talk, and then we will open it to the floor. Now, Greg, again, was somebody who will need very little introduction to you. I think he, as you can see from his biography, epitomizes the American system whereby you can move effortlessly and indeed repeatedly between academia, politics, business, and intelligence. At the moment, I'm not sure if RAND actually counts as business. I suppose it does because it's there to make a profit. But Greg has very wide tastes ranging from economics to intelligence and security and the implications of development. So no further ado, over to you, Greg, to talk about the future of open brackets counter closed brackets intelligence.
Well, thank you. It's a pleasure and an honor to be here, and particularly to celebrate this anniversary with you. RAND is a nonprofit organization, but as my colleagues keep reminding me, that means it's a non-loss organization as well. So a certain amount of business sense makes sense. I've been around long enough so I can't talk without slides. Somebody was going to help by calling them up for me. I have not changed my topic, though you may think I have once you listen to me. I also am very fond of the line by W.H. Auden, "Thou shalt not with statisticians sit, nor commit a social science." But since you are a studies association, I may actually commit a little social science today, and I'd like in particular to connect what I say to this morning, maybe give some specific examples, and then the latter half of my presentation will really be very much work in progress in keeping with the idea of this as a studies association. Say a word about these four things. Say a word about the change in target. David and others have emphasized that. I think it's really important we keep mouthing that the nature of the target has changed, but I think it makes an enormous difference across all of what we used to call and probably no longer should call the intelligence cycle. Illustrate that with terrorism, and then the second half will get into some issues that for me are increasingly on my agenda, trying to think about the nature of intelligence, particularly intelligence analysis, and then also pick up some specific issues that emerged from a fascinating opportunity I had to walk around the various American intelligence agencies and ask what use they were making of social networking media like Twitter and Facebook. I should say I was very much hoping Jennifer would be here for lots of reasons, but she is much more interested and knowledgeable about counterintelligence than I am. I won't say much at all about counterintelligence, so I'd be happy to answer questions. I'll really be focusing mostly on analysis and collection, though as you will see, I no longer think those categories are particularly helpful. First, the nature of the threat. This is pretty familiar. Let me just emphasize a couple of aspects of the change target. Somebody said we talked about the Cold War this morning so much it got boring. So think of Cold War here as a metaphor. But first, the objects of scrutiny. We used to be interested in big things like tank armies. Now we're interested in small things like lone wolf terrorists, like Osama bin Laden. Second, I've come to think that intelligence, in my career in and out of intelligence, is mostly about telling stories, about helping people build stories in their heads and then adjust those stories. If they don't have a story, then a new bit of information is just a factoid. It's likely to bounce off their consciousness. Now we know, on the other hand, if the story gets too fixed, then we call it a mindset, and it's usually the root of what we call an intelligence failure. But what strikes me about the current target is we had a story about states. We knew they had addresses, they were bureaucratic, they were hierarchical. Not so of transnational actors like terrorists. Over time, we may develop a story about them, but we don't have one yet. Witness the argument about what Al-Qaeda is, a network, a hierarchy. Before we thought it might be a venture capitalist, and now we think it may be an ideological inspiration. Elements of all those, but that's not much of a story. The other two things that strike me about the change of target, the others, I won't mention the others there, just there for you to take a look at. The interaction with the target matters enormously, I think. In the old days, those Cold War days we talked about so much this morning, we hoped to have some influence over the Soviet Union, but we didn't really expect to. As Harold Brown, former defense secretary, put it to Congress, he said, of the U.S.-Soviet nuclear competition, when we build, they build. When we stop, they build. Point being that the Soviet Union was going to do more or less what it was going to do, and the challenge for intelligence was to understand the what and why questions that David emphasized this morning. Terrorists are utterly different, absolutely different. They're only interacting with us. They're only looking for our vulnerabilities, for our seams. Take the 9/11 hijackers. They weren't airplane buffs. They'd done enough good tactical reconnaissance to know their plan would succeed. They could get those box cutters on commercial aircraft. Similar token, other groups are looking for our vulnerabilities. With the Soviet Union, there were things to count. With terrorist groups, there's really nothing to count. We can't even measure their capabilities by counting anything. They are, as our Pentagon friends would put it, the ultimate asymmetric threat. And that means, I think, particularly awkward for intelligence, that intelligence has to understand not just them, but a lot about us. You can't understand them without understanding us. That seems to me to make intelligence in this new threat environment about net assessment as much as it is about pure intelligence. That's particularly awkward for many of us countries where we've had a strict separation between foreign intelligence and domestic work. That's among the many categories that get crossed by the changed nature of the threat. And finally, maybe this is obvious, but it's also something I think gets forgotten. What strikes me is that while there was a lot of intelligence in the Cold War, deterrence didn't depend much on intelligence. It wasn't an intelligence-rich strategy. All we had to do was assume that the Soviet leaders were more or less rational in our terms, weren't interested in getting themselves blown off the face of the earth. Not true of this target. Not only may they be willing to get themselves blown off the face of the earth, but if we're going to, as David put it, if we're going to become the protection, that's going to be the main business, then we need to prevent terrorist attacks. We know we can't prevent them all, but if we're going to try and prevent, that's a very demanding, maybe a too demanding task for intelligence. These early warning, I've been thinking about early warning lately. Let me use that as an example of the nature of the change target. I'm very fond, as many of you know me, of the distinction between puzzles and mysteries in intelligence. I've now added complexities. But puzzles are those questions, like many of the Cold War questions, the answers to which Mark still remembers. How many warheads does the SS-19 have? How accurate is it? All those were puzzles. They had an answer. We just didn't know it. So we spent billions of dollars on sophisticated intelligence systems to learn it. Mysteries are different. They don't have an answer, even in principle. They're iffy. They're contingent. They depend. And maybe they depend on us and our policies as well. They do, however, come with some shape. If the question is, what will Russia's inflation rate be this year? Nobody knows the answer, but we have some idea how economies work. We know what to look for. We know what variables matter most. There is some shape to the problem. Complexities are, I think of as mysteries plus. They're mysteries that come to us without much history, without much shape, without much theory. Unfortunately, many of the interesting questions in the counterterrorism fight, I think, are complexities. They arise from small actors interacting in ways we haven't seen, arising in new ways, new attack modes, new connections. And therefore, the challenge is, what can intelligence do with complexities? Now, maybe over time, we'll resolve complexities toward mysteries as we gain some better understanding, some sense for what to look for. This is a translation into Rumsfeld's famous categories. Known knowns are facts. Known unknowns are puzzles or mysteries. They're the things we know we don't know. Complexities are the unknown unknowns, the things we don't know we don't know. And then I like a category he didn't use, the unknown knowns. Those are the things we know, but maybe just forgot or didn't remember or used to know. I put on the slide the flying schools in the summer before 2001. I had a nice example. I was with one of David and John's former colleague, now still in the British government, in their civil contingency secretariat. And he said, how can they possibly have expected us to predict or think about this ash cloud? And then he looked into it, and it turned out that an ash cloud was on the Department of Transport's list for a long, long time. It just never made it to the priority, never made it to the attention of the Cabinet Office. Another form of an unknown known, in that case not because it got forgotten, just because it didn't get in the right place at the right time. Warning, it strikes me, particularly classic warning of war, sought to turn mysteries into puzzles. So it would say, if the question is, are they going to attack, then we develop a set of indicators. I'm not great at graphics, the little circles on the slide, and we watch those out of garrison activity, exercises, size of exercises, mobilizations. And if we see as we see those indicators begin to light up, begin to turn red, we increase our sense of probability that they might attack. It is in that sense Bayesian. I think all intelligence is essentially Bayesian. The warning makes it obvious. If you're trying to solve a puzzle, then as each one of those indicators lights up, you think it more and more likely that the attack will happen. In that sense, remember, Rumsfeld was wrong. He said the absence of evidence is not necessarily the evidence of absence. He may have been right in some political sense, in some absolute sense, but he was wrong in a Bayesian sense. For each day that went by that the inspectors didn't find weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, we should have raised our probability that he doesn't have WMD. I think it's even more important to think in a Bayesian manner about complexities. Here's an example of a Bayesian analysis applied to a problem we did a few years ago. This was looking at potential weapons of mass destruction use by domestic terrorist groups. Now, in this case, we had to have some sense that a group might be interested in a terrorist act. So we had to be on to the group. Come back to that in a second. But if we did have that sense, then we were building the set of pathways that a group would have to go through to build a weapon of mass destruction, a CBRN weapon. Now, it got pretty complicated because there are lots of different pathways, particularly once you get beyond nuclear weapons. But the idea was to look at those pathways, and then you'd turn them into indicators and say, okay, at each step along the path, how important is a particular action to building that weapon? Excuse me. How unique is it? That is, how much is it uniquely associated with building the weapon as opposed to some other commercial purpose? And how detectable is it? Ideally, we would like to look at steps that were high on all of those. The problem is they're not likely to be high. Take something like laboratory equipment, which is up there. That's obviously high in importance if you're building a chemical or biological weapon, but it's not very unique. There are lots of other purposes in society to which it could be put. Ditto, hiring a microbiologist somewhere, maybe not quite so important, and maybe a little more unique if you saw a would-be terrorist group trying to hire microbiological talent. As I said, the challenge of this, though, is it depended on having some sense that a group might be a terrorist group and that it might be interested in building a nefarious weapon. It is in the second category here, what I think of as investigative intelligence domestically. It's a Rumsfeld known unknown. You got to be onto the group before you could apply this pathways analysis. The greater challenge is exploratory, that is, searching for the unknown unknowns and also remembering the unknown knowns. That's obviously, particularly in domestic terms, we've talked about that some already and will more, it's obviously very sensitive because it takes you into data mining, looking at big data sets, and in general takes you into handling information about a lot of people who have done absolutely nothing wrong. So it raises very sensitive issues. My menu, first steps toward reshaping analysis to meet the change threat would comprise the ones on the slide. In a certain sense, I think during the Cold War, we tended to try and turn people into machines in intelligence. We wanted to root out all those things that humans do best, like have biases, have hunches, have stereotypes. Those we were trying to root out. It seems to me the right approach is sort of the opposite, to say, okay, let's let machines do what they do best and let humans do what they do best. Machines are great at searching large amounts of data, at remembering things, at resurrecting old patterns they've seen before that we've forgotten, and it's the people that need to apply the judgment. We need to do experiments. I would turn all these into experiments and pilot projects. Some of that's happening, I think, in all of our intelligence services. In my view, not enough. We now know a lot about teams, financial institutions, maybe not the best of examples these days, but they used to think that gray-green teams were right, putting together older people with judgment together with fearsome youngsters. Ditto, we've thought a lot about insiders and outsiders, so we know a lot about how to put together teams. My favorite is creativity. Every blue ribbon panel in the United States always says intelligence should be more creative, so you can kind of legislate creativity. But it is interesting, we know enough from our cognitive psychologist friends to know something about creativity. And the one thing we know for sure is that people can only be creative if they've got some downtime, if they're not running 100 miles an hour. Well, what are most intelligence analysts and all our services doing? Running 100 miles an hour. So here my favorite pilot project, which will never be adopted, would be to take a group of good analysts, give them a hard, interesting problem like how is Al-Qaeda morphing, send them out of Washington, well out of Washington, say we don't want to hear from you till you have something to tell us, do whatever you want, talk to experts, walk in the woods, go to the movies, and come back and tell us when you've got something interesting to say. Well, as you see, it's not likely to happen. I posed the question, how important is being predictive? David mentioned that this morning. How important is getting it right? That's really the subject that I've been thinking about lately, and let me turn to that next. Here, what strikes, I had, I don't know how many of you know Jomini. Is Jomini a name well known to you? He was a 19th century Swiss by birth strategist. He and Clausewitz had some debate even at the time, and there are very different views of intelligence. For Jomini, the goal is to eliminate uncertainty. Clausewitz, to assess it. Jomini says, well, there's a right answer. If only you can find enough data, good enough hypotheses, you can get the answer right. Clausewitz, fog of war, we know that we're never going to know all the truth. Jomini says more information and better concepts, narrow uncertainty. Clausewitz comes close to saying the opposite, that single point estimates are bound to be wrong. And large uncertainty for Jomini says you haven't done a very good analytic job. Clausewitz, by comparison, implies, didn't quite say it, implies that if you did better and better analysis, you might even, in some sense, increase uncertainty by finding new hypotheses that were of interest. Well, my proposition, at least for the United States, and I leave it as an exercise for the rest of you, my proposition is that U.S. intelligence talks about managing uncertainty, it talks about Clausewitz, but acts Jomini. The classic Jomini-esque publication is Roberta Wohlstedter's, a wonderful book, but the whole premise of the book is that the information is there to have gotten the answer right. If only we'd put it together, if only the right people had talked and seen the right things, a better analysis would have gotten the right answer. Ditto, I've run the national estimates process in the United States, and we always want to have kind of a best estimate, and then we say, well, what are some excursions around it? We do worry about batting averages. And even our methods seem to me have a Jominian flavor about them. Take analysis of competing hypotheses. It says they should compete, which implies that in the end, one hypothesis will win. It'll be better. It'll be the better hypothesis. So I imagine if we did follow Clausewitzian logic, very different. It would say confidence and probability are different. Therefore, no reason not to make probability assessments, even if you don't have much confidence. Importantly, it says the content of the information matters as much as its reliability. So if information is interesting, even if not very reliable, ought to include it. And maybe most important, it says consequence matters. So that we ought to give not just excursion attention, but considerable direct attention to those outcomes that may not be very likely, or we may not be able to estimate their likelihood very well, but have very high consequences. In effect, it would lay out for policymakers not a best estimate in some excursions, but a kind of probability distribution. And it would lay out the most consequential possible outcomes in more or less equal space. Well, that raises the obvious example of would any policymaker sit still for this or feel well served by it? I come back to that in a second. Let me just give you, this is partly a commercial, of which I apologize. This was a piece we did at RAND in mid-2009, which is Clausewitzian in spirit. We didn't say that it was likely that Mubarak was going to fall. We did say a transition is coming. We knew that because of the elections. And what we did is identified 5 pillars of the regime. Play them, I won't repeat them. We identified the military is critical, said the military's got to change sides or become neutral for something to happen. And then we laid out the logic of 4 different paths to regime change or regime collapse in Egypt. And one of those was very much like what ultimately happened. We didn't say it was likely. Indeed, we didn't give likelihood estimates across them. We just looked rather evenly at these 4 different possibilities that happen to include one quite close to what actually happened. So it was as close to a Clausewitzian example as I've seen recently. So the question then does arise, would anybody sit still for it? Would a policymaker who we know always wants the answer? They know they can't have the answer, but they always want it. It's human nature. So then I asked the question, when might they sit still for it, ranging across tactical, operational, and strategic. Tactical, it seems to be by definition, is Jominian. If we're trying to find a person or target a tank unit, then we either get it right or we get it wrong, and that's the sole test. There is a right answer, and we want to get it. It's a puzzle, and we want to get it. At the other extreme, it does seem to me that for strategic analysis, a Clausewitzian process might be interesting and might be welcomed by policymakers. Rather than getting a best estimate, which they know is probably likely to be wrong, to get a serious treatment of the most consequential outcomes. And for operational things, I mentioned how is al-Qaeda morphing or exploring unknown groups, maybe some combination of the two. In any case, the way to try this, I think, would be to take a very strategic product like U.S. national intelligence estimates and try a few on a Clausewitzian approach and see if anybody liked the result. I did find one NIE that was Clausewitzian. It was done in 1990 at the very end of the Soviet Union. And it really asked for the next year, what are possible paths for the Soviet Union? Not very far reaching, but it did sort of lay out 4 separate paths, much as we did for Egypt. Finally, some excursions. This, as I said, these grow out or are reinforced by work I did on social networking media. I have to say it was a fascinating experience. I didn't expect to find much. Found a lot more in the various U.S. agencies than I'd expected. In almost every case, won't surprise you to learn, the process was similar. An analyst or operator, usually young, not always, but always technologically savvy, would have an idea, like we can use Twitter for this or Facebook for that. Spend the next 4 months persuading his or her boss that this project was work, not play. If that succeeded, then they'd spend the next 4 months trying to persuade the lawyers that it was legal, and if all went well, they'd do it. Some really quite interesting operations resulted. Beyond the open source world, they get quickly highly classified, but it was impressive, all bubbling up from the bottom. This morning we bemoaned many things about young analysts. This is one of the really good things about young analysts. This stuff is second nature to them, and they naturally think of ways to exploit the things that they've come to know in their personal lives. Interesting also because if you think about organizational cultures, intelligence is basically passive and closed. The social networking media are active and open. So no surprise that it was fascinating to watch the organizations wrestle internally with trying to do things, interesting things, with these new media. In that sense, I thought of the social networking media as kind of the advanced edge of a set of trends that's going to affect intelligence in any case, and this was a nice experiment. So the proposition behind this work are these two. One is that information technology is really enabling a whole new set of things. If you think about producing intelligence, in some sense, wikis would be a perfect way to do intelligence, because you'd have a place where different people could contribute. The tracks of their contributions would be clear. It would be a living document, not a dead document. It could be adapted, updated all the time. Problem is, nowhere in the US government do we do real intelligence by wikis. People that participate on these wikis in the classified space are generally regarded as not the top analysts. They're the people who have time to do it. The top analysts are off producing in the usual way, branded, stovepiped, in the usual way we do analysis. Ditto crowdsourcing. You all know the red balloon story. And some private organizations have begun to invite the public to help even with what we'd all recognize are intelligence questions. DARPA, the advanced research arm of the Pentagon, is actually trying an experiment in Afghanistan with crowdsourcing to try and see if they can learn about the situation in various localities in Afghanistan by reaching out in different ways to the people who live there, in effect, crowdsourcing. The other is really thinking about new forms of policy and the kind of intelligence they might require, or the kind of connections between intelligence and policy. This may be getting to the far edge, even for a studies association, but let me spend just a couple of minutes on it. I don't know how many of you are familiar with Taleb. Probably everybody knows about black swans. His later idea I find even more interesting, and that's the idea of anti-fragility. He says we all think that the opposite of fragile is durable. He says that's wrong. The opposite of fragile isn't durable. The opposite of fragile would be something that positively benefited from being bounced around, that positively benefited from being a suitcase on an airline. It would be anti-fragile, not merely durable. Well, so thinking about policies that are anti-fragile is I've found fascinating, hard to come by. Taleb's example are bacteria, that if you have a vaccine or an antidote, if you get it right, you can kill the bacteria, but if you don't get it right, you'll make it stronger because it'll mutate. It'll take new forms. Or learning organizations, they're meant in principle to be anti-fragile, at least across some range. Nothing is perfectly anti-fragile, just as though nothing is perfectly fragile. But a learning organization will get killed by some shocks, but other shocks should make it better as it responds. So that's my second project for the future. Here's the information technology point. That we started out with mainframes, didn't have much connectivity or many users. We then moved into PCs, a lot more users, but still not a lot of connectivity. And now we're up here to analysis in the cloud, where in principle we've got both lots of connectivity and lots of users. And in principle that ought to open new kinds of solutions, of which crowdsourcing is only one of the first. This is a little complicated, but this is the idea behind different kinds of policy. Fragiles down here. Fragile policies are a kind of immediate response to a particular problem, limited range of effectiveness. Robust policies, broad but still have a fixed range. Then we'd like to move up here to adaptive. Here I think that Taleb's second good idea from Anti-Fragile is this, and that is that when presented with a policy problem, our typical instinct is to fix the problem. Where fixing it often means something like fixing a broken plate, returning as close as we can to the previous status quo. Taleb says that's a very narrow view of policy. What we ought to do is think of adapting to a new status quo that might even be opportunities. I want to start with threats, let me end with opportunities, and then ultimately, ideally, we get to anti-fragile policy solutions. Make it a little less abstract. Wait a second, I think I had an example somewhere. I lost it. Oh, I had a slide with an example. If you think about climate change policy, down here, Kyoto was very fragile. An immediate response, but once the Chinese wouldn't play, we wouldn't play, the Australians, a very fragile set of policies. Or think about most of our policies toward the Middle East, toward Egypt, very fragile. And indeed, the debate we had after Mubarak went was precisely about, should we treat this as a fragile problem and try and fix it, get more stability, or should we think of it as an adaptive problem where it might have some opportunities for the future? So in the climate change area, Kyoto fragile, then Kyoto becomes really, at Cancun and Copenhagen, becomes a coalition of the willing, somewhat more robust. Up here, then the adaptive approach to climate change would be some aspects of geoengineering, where you say, basically, we're not going to go back to pre-industrial revolution levels of carbon in the atmosphere. We need to adapt. And then over here in anti-fragile policies, don't have good examples, but in principle, you might think of something like resilient communities as an anti-fragile approach to lots of different problems, where, for instance, if the community had its own capability to generate power and something happened to the bigger grid, not only would that community survive, but it might even benefit by selling power back on to the big grid. So getting close to anti-fragile, though the quest, I agree, is a hard one. The question then is, if we think about policy in that way, what does it mean for intelligence? And there, I'm only beginning to think about what that might mean. Let me conclude, John, with just a couple of others. Now, these are more specific things that came out of the social media work. The first one is, increasingly it's the case that the content of social media is images, not words. That's obvious with Facebook, but it's increasingly true of Twitter as well. And what strikes me is we used to think in intelligence that pictures were a way to tell the story. Now, they are the story. Think about the Iranian woman, or think about Abu Ghraib. Once the picture was out, game, set, and match. It was done. Right? Trying to think what that means for, I know it has meaning for intelligence, and trying to work through that is something very much on my agenda. Second, what is publication? You know, we used to think you published something. It was sort of a commodity. You put it out there, had some shelf life. That's no longer true. Now you can have something like a wiki and continually update. That's the good side. The bad side is anybody can effectively publish anything, as we know when we get on the web and look at blogs or people's postings. So how that affects how intelligence thinks about its publication process also seems to be an important issue for the future. Last, I have a bumper sticker for which I lack the car. The bumper sticker is that intelligence needs to reshape how it thinks about its products if it's going to reshape itself. so long as it primarily thinks it's in the business of producing branded, stovepiped, discrete words on a piece of paper or bytes on a screen, it seems to me that's terribly limiting. I've been working with a group of young analysts in Washington, and the first thing they said is, we got to stop talking about products. So I now call these outputs, recognizing that the product might be a conversation, not a piece of paper, and I don't want to prejudge that. About as far as I've gotten, I haven't gotten very far on this in 15 years, you'll see, but I had the insight when I was managing the national estimates process in the United States. I realized one day that we thought of our products, our outputs, as national intelligence estimates, those pieces of paper. I realized, no, our real products were national intelligence officers. They were, as Mark said this morning, people there to be in a meeting, to be at lunch, to talk to a policymaker, and give advice tailored very much to what was on the mind and agenda of that policymaker. And by the way, in those conversations, intelligence officers don't have to hew so carefully to the thou shalt not trespass in policy area. They can give advice. Remember Colin Powell, he said he wanted intelligence analysts to do three things. He wanted them to play music. No, he wanted them to, at least patriotic here. He wanted them to tell him what they knew, tell him what they didn't know, and tell him what they thought. It seems to me, particularly as Mark said, in a crisis, the emphasis on what it is you think. How do you feel? What's your sense? What's your Fingerspitzengefühl for this is really important, and despite all the technology, probably has to be in person. But that's about as far as I've gotten on the rethinking the outputs of intelligence. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Greg.